In the silent depths of an underground garage, a man who had everything stumbled upon someone who had nothing. A powerful CEO, worn down by endless meetings and empty victories, suddenly froze when he heard the faintest sound a child sniffle in the shadows. There she was, a little girl no older than 6, barefoot, bruised, hiding behind a pillar as if the world itself had turned against her. When she whispered, "Please don't tell them I'm here," his heart cracked open in a way that fortune, power, and status had never managed to do. What began as a chance encounter would become a journey that would shatter his beliefs, ignite his buried compassion, and reshape everything he thought he knew about love, memory, and redemption. Stay with us, and if your heart believes in second chances, subscribe to Loss and Healing because some stories change us forever. The underground garage was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. James Whittaker's footsteps echoed against polished cement, each click of his shoes a reminder of the power and isolation that came with his position. The hum of a motion sensor light buzzed faintly above a sleek black Bentley, and for a moment he thought it was just another Thursday night ending in exhaustion. His overcoat draped perfectly across his shoulders, his tie loosened just enough to suggest fatigue without weakness, and the gleam of his Rolex caught the dim glow like a mirror to a life he no longer recognized. In one hand, he carried his phone, glowing with a dozen urgent messages, in the other his briefcase, which tonight seemed heavier than usual. He had built an empire from nothing, carving his way through boardrooms and battles of will. But somewhere along the way, he had misplaced the reason he started. The congratulatory emails, the invitations, the shareholder demands, they all blurred into a static that seemed to drown out even the sound of his own thoughts. His sister had sent a video of her daughter's birthday, the little girl clapping over a cupcake with 7 tiny candles, asking if her Uncle James would come. He had pressed delete without thinking. His chest still ached from the hollowness of that choice when he heard it the faintest sound, soft and trembling, so fragile he almost dismissed it. A shuffle, a sniffle, he froze. The sensation that ran through him was instinctive, a chill at the base of his neck that carried echoes of old reflexes from years past. Afghanistan had left its imprint on him, scars that no Armani suit could disguise. His hand rose automatically to the pressure point near his skull, that place that always ached when memory slipped through. He turned his head slowly, scanning the garage, breath tight in his chest. That was when he saw her. A small shape crouched near a concrete pillar, motionless yet radiating fear. He took cautious steps forward, lowering his shoulders, careful not to let his presence startle her. As he rounded the corner, he froze. A girl, no more than 6, sat curled against the cold wall, her hair tangled around her face, her cheeks pale beneath the flickering light. One cheek bore the purpling mark of a bruise, still fresh, as if life itself had struck her without warning. She wore no shoes, her socks worn thin, and her faded dress looked tired, its once bright animals washed almost invisible. There was no dirt caked on her skin, but a weariness clung to her that felt heavier than grime, the kind of erosion that comes when care is absent for too long. He crouched slowly, lowering himself to her level, setting down his briefcase with deliberate care. "Hey," he said softly, his voice stripped of its boardroom sharpness, "You okay?" She flinched at the sound but did not run. Instead, her voice emerged in a whisper that nearly broke him. "Please don't tell them I'm here." James's throat tightened. The words carried a weight no child should ever carry. "I won't," he promised, his voice firm but gentle. "I promise." For a long moment they remained in silence. He studied her small frame, the way she pulled her knees to her chest, the way her fingers twitched against the fabric of her dress, as if they longed to hold something that was not there. He slipped off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. She did not resist. The heavy wool enveloped her tiny form, and for the first time that evening, he felt his heart slow. His phone buzzed in his pocket again, urgent messages from people who claimed to matter. But none of it mattered as much as this child sitting on the cold ground, shivering and silent. He asked her name gently, but at first, her lips moved without sound. Then came the faintest whisper, "Lila." It was a name barely more than a breath, but to him, it carried the weight of a revelation. "Hi, Lila," he said, offering a faint smile. "You're safe now." She looked up at him, her eyes wide and rimmed red. not from tears shed, but from tears held back for far too long. In her gaze, he saw something haunting, something older than her
So
years.
how long have you been in this building?
She tilted her head as
Not
though
too long,
trying to
actually.
make sense of him, as if she had only ever seen men like him from far away, men in expensive coats who lived in towers she could never enter. Then she spoke again, her words cutting deep. The last man said I'd forget things too, like Mommy did. James blinked, stunned by the strangeness of her statement. He wanted to ask what she meant, but she curled back into herself, burying her chin against her knees. She would say no more. Overhead, the light flickered, the elevator chimed in the distance, and his phone buzzed once more, relentless in its demands. But for the first time in years, James ignored it. His focus was here, on this fragile child who had appeared like a secret, waiting to be uncovered. He extended his hand slowly, uncertain if she would take it. She hesitated, then looked up, eyes searching his face. Something passed between them, a quiet trust forming not in words but in silence. He did not think about what came next, about responsibility, about consequences. He thought only of the promise he had made, that she was safe, that he would not leave her here in the cold. And as he lifted her into his arms, wrapping her tightly in his coat, he felt the shift, a fracture in the life he thought unbreakable. She rested her small head against his chest like a broken wing tucked away, and without realizing it, James Whittaker, CEO and Millionaire, began walking toward a different kind of future. He stepped through the glass doors of Whittaker Tower, past the concierge who blinked in surprise at the sight. "Sir, should I call someone?" the man asked carefully. James did not slow his pace. "No," he replied, his voice steady. "I've got it." And with those words, he crossed a threshold he could never uncross, carrying not just a child, but the fragile spark of redemption he never knew he was waiting for. The executive lounge on the 23rd floor was built to impress, a space where billion-dollar negotiations were meant to feel inevitable. Golden light spilled across polished marble. The walls were adorned with museum-quality art, and the windows framed a city skyline that glimmered against the winter night. But as James carried the little girl inside, wrapped in his coat, all that grandeur felt hollow. She weighed so little in his arms, her presence so fragile, that every luxury surrounding them seemed obscene by comparison. He set her gently onto a velvet couch near the window. She curled instantly into herself, knees to her chest, silent as stone, her gaze unfocused as though the world around her did not exist. James loosened his tie and watched her. He did not know what to do, and the realization unnerved him. In boardrooms, he always had answers. With investors, he always had leverage. Here, with this child staring through him, he had nothing. His phone buzzed again. Alerts from the board, updates from overseas markets, a missed call from his legal team. He stared at the glowing screen, then set it face down on the table.
I am good.
The silence that followed pressed against his chest like a weight. He tried to reach her with small gestures. He retrieved a bottle of water from the minibar and set it beside her with a granola bar, an offering of ordinary kindness. She looked at them but made no move to touch either. Her fingers remained gripping the edge of his coat, knuckles pale. James sat across from her, wrestling with an unfamiliar frustration. He was a man who had risen by solving problems, yet here he was, face to face with a child whose pain could not be solved with money, power, or intellect. All he could do was stay. When he asked what had happened, her response was faint, each word trembling as if it might fall apart before reaching his ears. "Mom sleeps a lot now." He leaned forward, trying to keep his voice calm. "What do you mean?" She toyed with the red sticker clinging to her wrist, its edges peeling. "Greg says it's okay. He gives her the sticker, same as mine. Says it helps." His stomach tightened. "Greg?" he asked, careful not to let his voice harden. "Is he your mom's boyfriend?" She shrugged, eyes lowering. "He's the one who moved in." The words settled like a stone in James's chest. He wanted to ask more, needed to, but her gaze was already retreating, her small body folding inward as though preparing to vanish. He knew he was losing her to silence. So instead of pressing, he tried something else. He let his voice soften into the gentlest version of himself, one that felt almost foreign. "You are safe here," he told her. She did not answer, but her fingers twitched against the coat, pulling it tighter around herself. He recognized that gesture not as rejection, but as something closer to hope. The night stretched on, thick with unanswered questions. He thought of calling security, of dialing child services, of placing this burden into the hands of those trained to handle it. That was the rational choice, the efficient solution. But when he reached for his phone, something stopped him. It was her hand, slipping from the folds of the coat, brushing his sleeve in the faintest of tugs. It was not desperate, not panicked, just a quiet hold as if to say, "Please do not leave." He looked down at her small fingers, pale against the dark wool, and knew then he could not walk away. Not tonight. Not ever. Later, when she finally spoke again, her words chilled him. "Please," she whispered, "don't make me go back. I don't like the buzzing." James's pulse quickened. What buzzing? She looked up at him then, and for the first time he saw something in her eyes that was older than any child should carry. At night, in the walls. "It makes mommy forget. It makes my head feel floaty." His fists clenched unconsciously, rage sparking beneath his ribs. Whatever this was, it was not just neglect. It was something darker, something deliberate. He understood in that moment that this was no accident. Someone had done this. Hours later, James found himself behind the wheel of his car, driving through the industrial outskirts of Boulder. The address printed on the hospital band around the girl's wrist had led him there, to a cinder block building that looked more like a forgotten motel than a home. The stairwell reeked of mildew and burnt plastic. The air was heavy with rot. And inside the apartment, he found her mother. Isabel lay collapsed on a stained mattress, her arms marked by the same red stickers clinging to her daughter's wrist. She was breathing, but only barely. The patches scattered around the room were labeled with warnings. Trial use only, not for distribution. James dialed 911, his voice steady in the way it had been in war zones and hostile boardrooms, though inside he felt anything but calm. As the paramedics rushed in, lifting Isabel onto a stretcher, Lila turned to him with panic flooding her eyes. "They won't take me away too, right?" she whispered, her voice breaking. James crouched down, his voice steady but low. "No one is taking you anywhere, not this time." She hesitated, searching his face for a lie, then slowly slipped her small hand into his. She did not let go. And in that simple act, James knew the truth. He was no longer standing at the edge of this story. He was inside it, and there was no turning back. The private wing of St. Albans Hospital was designed for silence. Frosted glass doors slid open without a sound. Beige lights glowed with calculated warmth, and the hum of machines formed a lullaby meant to calm restless nerves. Isabel Monroe, admitted under a false name, lay unconscious in a bed that looked too large for her frail body. Her arms were wrapped in bandages that concealed the angry circles left behind by the patches. Her chest rose and fell with shallow rhythm, as though life itself was uncertain about holding on. James stood outside her room, his hands clenched at his sides, his reflection faint in the glass. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about markets or mergers. He was thinking about responsibility, about guilt, about how many signatures he had put on papers without reading the fine print. Behind him, in room 408, Lila sat cross-legged on a bed with crisp new linens. The staff had given her juice and a tablet with cartoons, but she had not touched either. Instead, she stared at the wall as though waiting for it to open and swallow her whole. James stepped into her room quietly, carrying a small paper bag. "I brought you something," he said, his voice softer than it had been in years. He pulled out a plush bunny, gray with long ears and stitched eyes. He remembered the book his sister used to read, about a rabbit who kept secrets in his paws. He placed the toy gently in Lila's lap. "He is good at keeping secrets," James whispered. "You do not have to carry them all by yourself." She looked at the bunny, then at him, but said nothing. Her silence was a wall, but it was a wall with cracks. That night, while she slept curled around the toy, James sat in the hallway with his tie loosened, his laptop open on his knees. He scrolled through archived files buried deep in Texas research divisions. Reports flagged years ago, scrubbed trials, experimental compounds that had never seen approval. With each document he opened, his anger grew sharper. NBX 42 had been tested on minors, hallucinations, memory distortion, neurological collapse. The FDA had shut it down, yet here it was, alive again, hidden under a different name. Someone inside his own company had not only revived it but distributed it recklessly. He checked the time. Nearly 2 in the morning. His eyes burned, but he could not stop. His phone buzzed with a message that made his jaw tighten. You are not supposed to be looking into NBX. Drop it or she disappears too. He deleted it without hesitation. The next day, he met with Dr. Sienna Lee at a quiet cafe. Years earlier, she had been labeled an idealist when she warned about the dangers of memory conditioning. Now she looked worn, her voice tempered with disillusion, but her eyes still burned with clarity. She examined the patches James slid across the table, her hands trembling. "This is not the same formula," she murmured. "It has been changed, refined, strengthened. It was always dangerous, but now it is something else entirely." James leaned forward, his voice low. "Is it legal?" Sienna laughed bitterly. "Only if you believe using children as test subjects is legal. Gregory Knox was obsessed with this. I reported him, and they buried my report. I resigned. I thought it had died with me walking away." James's jaw clenched. "He is back. The girl hears buzzing. Her mother is in a coma. I found these patches in their apartment." He slid a trial report toward her, one she herself had flagged years ago. Her face paled. "They never destroyed the batch," she whispered. "They repackaged it." James sat in silence for a long moment, his hand pressed against his forehead. Sienna leaned closer. "If she has been exposed long-term, she may already have neurological adaptations. You need to watch her carefully. If she starts losing time, get her scanned immediately." James nodded. The words long-term echoed in his mind like a curse. He thought of Lila's red-rimmed eyes, her whispered fear of buzzing in the walls, her mother's limp body, and the bruises blooming like accusations. This was not chance. This was not a mistake. This was a system, deliberate and cruel. Back at the hospital that evening, he returned to her room. Lila was sitting up, the bunny in her hand, flipping the pages of a children's book without reading them. When she looked up at him, her expression shifted. For the first time, she did not look away. "You came back," she said, her voice small but steady. He smiled, though it felt fragile on his face. "Of course I did." And with that simple exchange, something shifted between them. It was not trust yet, but it was no longer fear. It was a beginning. The days that followed blurred into a strange rhythm. James stopped showing up to the boardroom. He ignored messages from investors. He spent his mornings at the hospital, afternoons digging through encrypted archives, evenings in room 408, with a girl who was slowly learning to blink without flinching. She said little, but her silence was no longer empty. It carried thought, even hope. Sometimes she would reach for his sleeve without realizing it, as if testing whether he was still there. Each time, he was. He brought her cocoa with tiny marshmallows one evening, stirring it slowly by hand. She sipped cautiously, then whispered, "It is good." He smiled. It was the first thing she had said all day. Later, as she drifted into sleep, she tucked the bunny under his arm. "So you do not forget," she murmured. He sat there in the quiet, holding a toy meant to guard secrets, realizing that he had already been entrusted with the most fragile secret of all her trust. James had always believed walls protected him. The high glass towers, the thick contracts, the guarded conversations, all of it built a fortress around his life. But that belief shattered the night the surveillance camera blinked awake, the tiny lens no larger than a button fed live images straight to his encrypted laptop. At 3:42 in the morning, the hallway outside Isabel Monroe's hospital room lit up with movement. A man in teal scrubs, masked and confident, walked toward the locked medication cabinet. He swiped a card that should not have existed, bypassed the lock, and reached for the door handle of Isabel's room. James froze the frame, staring at the man's eyes. Even beneath the mask, the bone structure was unmistakable. Gregory Knox, he had not broken in, he had been invited. Someone inside had sold the passage. Betrayal had already seeped into the walls James thought were safe. Before he could act, a voice crackled through the intercom. "Code Blue, room 408. His heart lurched as he ran. The sight that met him seared itself into memory. Lila lay on the hospital bed, her small body convulsing, her lips tinged blue, monitors screaming in chaos. Doctors shouted orders, nurses scrambled with IV lines, and James was pushed back against the doorway, powerless. His voice cut through the noise. "What happened?" "Neurological collapse," the lead doctor shouted. "We are losing her." An hour later, he stood beside Dr. Sienna Lee in a dim lab, the glow of digital scans reflecting against their faces. Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed dread. "This is not a virus," she said. It is synthetic, a parasite feeding on her neural signals, blocking memory formation, rewriting circadian rhythms. James's fists clenched until his knuckles whitened. How long has it been inside her? Too long, Sienna answered. 6 to 8 weeks, maybe more, and it is accelerating. He asked the only question that mattered. Can you treat it? She hesitated, then turned to him. Not with anything approved. The parasite is fused to her nerves. If we attack it too quickly, she could lose brain function. If we leave it, her body shuts down. James felt a storm of rage and helplessness rip through him. Then she spoke again, her voice lower. You told me once you were part of the V92 military trial in 2007. That vaccine left you with permanent anomalies. If even a fragment of that immunity could be isolated, it might create a serum strong enough to disrupt this parasite. James met her eyes without hesitation. Do it. Sienna stepped closer. James, this could kill you. The filtration process is untested. If it fails, you could bleed out before it stabilizes. He was already rolling up his sleeve. I was not there for her when this started, but I will not leave her now. Minutes later, he lay on a padded gurney in the emergency synthesis lab. Tubes coiled from his arm into a filtration system glowing faint blue. Machines hummed, separating plasma, scanning for anomalies, recombining strands of immunity forged years ago in military labs. He could see her through the glass wall, her small frame lying so still it hurt to look at her. She called me daddy yesterday, he whispered. The words cracked in his throat. Sienna glanced at him, her expression softening. Maybe it was not a question. The serum shimmered as it was drawn into a syringe, glowing faintly like captured light. Sienna carried it into the isolation chamber where Lila lay and injected it gently.
Where is my baby?
The monitors erupted into chaos. Her heart rate dropped, her breathing slowed to nothing. The flatline pierced the air like a blade. James slammed his palm against the glass. Do something! Wait, Sienna said firmly. Give it time. 10 seconds stretched into eternity. Then, a sound. A beep. Another. Breath returned to the room, fragile but real. James pressed his forehead to the glass, tears slipping unnoticed down his face. She is stabilizing, Sienna whispered. Relief broke through his chest, leaving him trembling. And then another voice called from across the hall.
Thank you for everything.
Dr. Lee, Isabel Monroe is waking up. James turned, stunned. They rushed to the adjoining room, where Isabel's eyelids fluttered and her lips moved with fragile sound. Where is my baby? She whispered. Lila had survived, and now her mother was clawing her way back from the edge. The morning after the serum was different. Snow drifted quietly outside the hospital windows, muffling the city's noise. Lila breathed on her own, wires loosened, her cheeks faintly pink again. Isabel sat upright for the first time in weeks, her eyes clearer, her thoughts sharper. When James stepped into her room, she looked at him with weary gratitude. You stayed, she said. He nodded. She asked me not to leave. Isabel blinked away tears. She trusts you. James lowered his gaze. I trust her. That came first. And in that moment, he knew the truth. This fight was no longer about responsibility or guilt. It was about love, raw and unchosen, the kind that binds without warning and without condition. The days that followed moved with a rhythm unlike anything James had known. They were not defined by board meetings, endless calls, or stock
Look
reports.
at our new home.
Instead,
It's so
they were
pretty.
filled with hushed moments in a hospital wing where time seemed to slow. Lila was healing, her small body steadying with each sunrise, though the shadows of what she had endured lingered in her eyes. Isabel was regaining her strength, her voice no longer just a whisper, but still carrying the fragility of someone returning from the edge. And James, for the first time in years, allowed himself to stay still long enough to feel the weight of what was unfolding around him. It began with small gestures. One morning, he returned from the cafe downstairs to find something placed neatly on top of his briefcase. A single butterscotch candy, unwrapped, resting carefully as if it were a treasure. It was not much, but it was hers, and she had given it to him. James picked it up slowly, realizing it might have been her only one. That kind of trust, he knew, was not won easily. He carried it with him the rest of the day, unable to shake the feeling that she had offered him not candy, but faith. Later, he met again with Dr. Sienna Lee.
What does
They
a bigger
sat in the
heart mean?
quiet of his penthouse lounge, papers spread across the table, the weight of buried truths between them. She laid out the records she had once flagged, files ignored and silenced by people who valued profit over lives. The words carved into those documents revealed a system not of healing but of control. They had chosen children with trauma, children whose resilience made them easier to manipulate, and turned them into test subjects. James's jaw tightened as he read the lines. It was no longer just about Isabel and Lila. There were more. There had always been more. And the company he had helped build was not innocent. His fingerprints, even if unknowing, were on these horrors. For the first time, he wanted to burn down everything he had created. But in the hospital, the war he carried inside him softened into something else. He would walk into room 408 and find Lila sitting with Oscar Bunny tucked under her chin, her silence no longer guarded but contemplative. Sometimes she would look at him for long stretches, as if weighing whether to let him further into her fragile circle. One afternoon, she reached for a folded piece of paper and handed it to him. He opened it carefully, expecting nothing more than a child's sketch. But what he saw stole his breath. 3 figures stood together. A woman with brown hair, a girl in a red dress, and a tall man with square shoulders and blue eyes. His hand was resting on the girl's shoulder. James blinked. "You added me?" She nodded quietly. "You don't forget things like mommy. You remember." He could not answer. His throat closed, his eyes stung, and the paper trembled in his hands. That night, he placed the drawing inside the gold box where he had once stored trophies and awards. For the first time in years, the box held something that mattered. As the weeks passed, Isabel grew stronger. She spoke more often, sometimes about the days before the patches, sometimes about dreams she once had. She watched James with cautious gratitude, understanding that his presence was no longer fleeting. Together, they began discussing what would come next. An attorney drafted guardianship papers, not to separate mother from daughter, but to ensure no one could ever take Lila away again. Isabel agreed, her voice steady as she told James, "She needs both of us, protection and trust." James nodded. For the first time in a long while, partnership meant more than a contract. When Lila was finally released from the hospital, James did not take them back to his penthouse. Instead, he drove south to a coastal house he had not visited in years. It stood quiet against the Florida shoreline, sand-colored walls and wide windows opening to the sea. Isabel sat wrapped in a blanket on the porch steps, while Lila ran barefoot across the beach, her laughter carried on the wind. James watched her draw shapes in the tide, and when he squinted, he saw what she had etched. A wide heart in the sand, and inside it 3 names: Mom, me, Dad. His throat caught, his chest tight with something he could no longer push away. Isabel turned to him, her voice soft. She asked if we could stay. I told her it was not up to me.
Okay, is that one good?
James looked at her, the ocean roaring quietly behind them.
Can you move that a bit to the
"It is now," he said. The wind that evening carried the sound of a small chime that hung outside the kitchen window. His sister had given it to him years before, and for so long it had been silent. But now it rang, a soft, almost hesitant sound, as though the house itself was waking from its own kind of slumber. In that moment, with the waves washing against the shore and laughter drifting from the sand, James knew that this place, this fragile beginning, was no accident. It was where they were meant to be. A family born not of design, but of survival and choice. A family that, against all odds, had found its way to each other. The morning of the conference felt different from the mornings James once knew. He used to wake to alarms, hurried calls, and a calendar filled with appointments that stretched into the night. Now he woke to the sound of Lila's quiet footsteps in the beach house and the faint hum of the waves outside. He sat at the edge of the bed, tying his shoes slowly, the weight of the day pressing down not like a burden, but like a responsibility he had chosen. Today was not about quarterly reports or shareholders. Today was about truth. The conference hall in Denver was filled with professionals, journalists, and families who had once trusted the wrong people. Cameras lined the back wall, their lenses sharp and unblinking. James stood at the podium with a banner glowing behind him, the Lila Foundation protecting what should never be tested. He cleared his throat and began, his voice steady though his chest ached with memory. I was a CEO who signed documents without reading between the lines. I trusted systems that were supposed to protect the innocent. I was wrong. A hush fell over the crowd. He continued, I met a little girl who was part of something she never chose. a trial she did not consent to. She changed everything. He paused, his eyes finding the camera, his words no longer aimed at the room but at the world.
It truly is.
We believe no child should ever be the price of progress. The applause that followed was not wild, but it was real, heavy with understanding. Back at the beach house, Isabel and Lila watched the clip on a laptop. Lila pointed to the screen. He looks serious when he is helping. Isabel smiled faintly. He is serious because he loves you. Lila tucked Oscar Bunny under her chin and nodded, as though that explanation made sense of everything. That night, the three of them walked along the shoreline together. Lila, barefoot in the moonlit tide, swung her arms between them, one hand in each of theirs. She stopped suddenly and bent down, drawing a heart in the wet sand with her finger. Then, without a word, she drew another heart, larger, encircling the first. "What is that one for?" James asked softly. Lila looked up at him, her voice sleepy but sure. "That one's us. So we never forget." He swallowed hard, unable to speak, and simply nodded. They stood there in silence, the waves lapping at the edges of her drawing, knowing it would wash away but never truly disappear. Life settled into a rhythm that felt almost holy in its simplicity. Mornings were filled with cocoa mustaches and the smell of toast. Afternoons were spent building sandcastles and reading stories under the sun. Evenings belonged to quiet talks on the porch while the sky swelled with stars. Isabel's strength returned slowly, her laughter tentative at first, then warmer as days passed. Sometimes the shadows of nightmares still haunted Lila's sleep, but they came less often, their grip weaker each time. James found himself awake some nights, sitting by her bed, listening to the sound of her steady breathing. Each inhale felt like proof that hope had not abandoned them. When the guardianship papers arrived, signed and sealed, James held them with trembling hands. It was temporary on paper, but it was permanent in his heart. Isabel sat across from him, her eyes soft. "This is not about losing her," she said. "This is about making sure she is never taken again." He nodded, understanding that what bound them was not obligation but choice. They were not replacing each other. They were building something new, together. One evening, Lila ran down the beach, calling for them to see the castle she had made. James crouched beside her as she pointed at the tiny figures she had drawn in the sand. "That's Mommy, that's me, and that's you. You are standing by the gate." He asked, "Why am I there?" She smiled, the kind of smile that carried a child's certainty.
Thank you.
"Because you never let anyone in who tries to hurt us." His throat tightened.
Welcome.
"That is a good place for me." She nodded and went back to digging, content that her world had walls strong enough now to keep her safe. Later, as night fell and Lila drifted to sleep under a quilt that smelled faintly of the ocean,
Thank you.
James and Isabel sat side by side on the porch. The waves whispered below, the stars shone above, and for once there was no need for words. Healing, James realized, was not about erasing the past. It was about carrying it differently, together. When Isabel leaned back and whispered, "I used to think healing meant forgetting," James answered softly, "Now I think it means remembering without breaking." The wind carried the sound of the chime outside the kitchen window. It had been silent for years, but now it rang with each gentle breeze. James listened, and for the first time, it did not feel like a relic of grief, but a promise of new beginnings. In that sound, in the laughter that lingered in the sand, in the steady breath of a child who once hid in a parking lot, he found something he thought he had lost forever. Home. There are moments in life that arrive without warning, moments that shake us from the routines we thought defined us. For James, it was the sound of a child's muffled cry in a dim parking garage. For Lila, it was the fragile safety she found in the arms of a stranger who chose not to walk away. And for Isabel, it was opening her eyes to find her daughter alive, protected by someone who refused to let her disappear into silence. These moments, stitched together by fear, trust, and unspoken love, became more than just survival. They became the story of a family born from brokenness, yet bound by choice. The truth is, healing rarely arrives in clean lines. It comes in fragments, an unwrapped piece of candy placed on a briefcase, a child's drawing folded carefully into a box once filled with trophies. The ringing of a forgotten chime stirred awake by the ocean breeze. It comes in the courage to face the weight of guilt and still choose to fight. In the tenderness of staying when leaving would have been easier. Healing is not the absence of pain. It is the decision to carry it differently, together, until it softens into strength. James did not set out to become a father, but love is rarely about plans. It is about presence. It is about showing up in the silence, about standing at the gate so no harm can pass, about remembering when forgetting would be easier. And Lila, with her small hands gripping his sleeve, reminded him of a truth he had long buried, that sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power to change us. If this story touched something in you, let it be more than just a story. Let it be a reminder that redemption is possible, that compassion is stronger than fear, and that families can be built in the unlikeliest of places. There are countless Lilas in the world, children, who need someone to stay, someone to believe, someone to fight for them. And there are countless chances for us to step into their lives, to make choices that matter, to heal what was broken. Here on Loss and Healing, we share these stories not just to move hearts, but to remind each of us that tomorrow can be different if we choose it. If you believe in the power of love to restore, if you believe that healing is worth the fight, then join us. Subscribe to Loss and Healing and walk with us through more stories that carry both the weight of sorrow and the light of redemption. Because even on the hardest days, tomorrow is still a gift, and together we can keep that truth alive.